All right, welcome. Thanks again for joining us today for our webinar on the contentious 2024 US elections. If you have a question during this event, please feel free to drop it in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. My name is Cliona Rowley. I'm the President and CEO of ACLED, and I will today moderate this discussion amongst three distinguished panelists. And before I introduce them, I wish to just review what it is that we hope to discuss today. So we are gathered in some ways to have an overview of the crisis, and I'm sure everybody on the call can appreciate that these last few weeks, if not years, in US politics has been incredibly active, if not potentially historic. And with all of this information and all of these changes coming quite quickly, we're hoping to use the monitoring of political violence and the threats in the US at present to determine what is the noise and what is the signal that's coming out of this political environment. We're going to have some scene setting from some of the people on the call today, and of course, reactions and thoughts from different vantages. So we at ACLED produce the US Crisis Monitor, which is updated continuously. And what we've been seeing, of course, in the last few years since we started in 2020, in fact, with BDI, who I will introduce in a moment, is that there has been drastic changes in the nature of political violence and in the nature of demonstrations across the US. And although these patterns are not at this moment in 2024 in any way similar to what we've seen in 2020, it suggests that there's something going on within the political environment that might in fact give rise to even further instability in the future. But at this exact moment, despite the circus act between the parties that we've just been witnessing in the last few months, the actual reactions from the public are quite different than they were in 2020 to various types of political stimuli. So very recently, we've just seen a decline in demonstrations during Pride Month. And of course, this was a real issue during the previous presidency relating to, of course, threats upon members of the LGBTQ plus community. And so this is a change that is in some ways a deviation from what we would expect, given the heightened nature and the polarization that we're seeing across the environment. We have in some ways witnessed a public that is exhausted from what they are witnessing politically, as I mentioned before, and so are unlikely to engage in the same level of demonstration and protest, even when the political situation is suggesting that the country is quite divided. But I will also say that despite the very bellicose language we heard from some members of the RNC, there is more language, there are more threats than there are actions. And that's something that we will be able to pick apart today and think about why we might see such surges in demonstrations around, for example, Gaza and the recent visit from Benjamin Netanyahu, but why we're not seeing it around more traditional areas that have given rise to protests before in the US. And we have three excellent speakers in order to guide us through this labyrinth of US politics and political violence. The first is our own Kieran Doyle, and he is the ACLED North American Research Manager, and he has been with the organization since October 2020, which was quite a time to start. He previously worked in local politics in the US and for human rights NGOs in Brussels. And of course, later started with us, and he's been covering sourcing and coding in multiple regions. He is, as I mentioned, the research manager for North America, and he oversees that team and performs quite a lot of data review and analysis. He has been cited and published in The Guardian, The Washington Post, and Reuters because of his excellent work these last 4 years with us. And of course, Shannon Hiller is the executive director of the Princeton University's Bridging Divides Initiative, which is a nonpartisan research group tracking and mitigating the risk of political violence in the US. She co-founded this initiative in 2019, following nearly a decade of work in international development and foreign policy. Prior to BDI, she served as Assistant Director for International Affairs and Operations at Princeton and as an advisor at USAID's Office of Transition Initiatives, where she supported country programs responding to political crisis and transition around the world. So she's well prepared to talk about the threats and harassments data set that BDI has been putting together, and of course the harassment of local officials, which will be a focus today. And I'm pleased to introduce it for our first time in an ACLED webinar, although hopefully not the last, Richard Barta, who is the Senior Manager of Global Intelligence at the Marriott International, where he oversees the company's geopolitical and security risk interests throughout the Western Hemisphere. Before joining Marriott's Global Safety and Security team, Richard served in the US State Department's Overseas Security Advisory Council, where he managed outreach programs and facilitated security information sharing as the premier international security public-private partnership in the US government. Prior to this, Richard held roles in USAID as well as research opportunities within the university and advocacy sectors. And Richard will be speaking to us about this applied experience, which I think will be invaluable when we think about how to understand what's happening in the US from these different vantages. And with that, I will ask Kieran to take it away to show us what the data are saying about political violence and threats. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. As I was just kindly introduced, my name is Kieran Doyle, and I am the North America Research Manager here at ACLED. I'm going to be speaking today about exploring some of the extremist activity we've been seeing in the US, and specifically far-right activity, as well as some of the demonstration drivers that we track that impacted the 2020 election in particular. So we're going to start on the next slide here by looking at extremist activity in general, and here on the graph, specifically far-right activity in the United States. ACLED tracks a number of different groups, including militant social movements, such as the Proud Boys, militia groups, white supremacist groups, accelerationist groups, neo-Nazis, and a number of other smaller categories. In the chart on the left, and to tee up the next couple of slides, this orange section is from 1st of January to 19th July, which might seem like an odd time span. This is just to highlight that we publish fresh, up-to-date data on a weekly basis. So this is all of the data that we have currently publicly available, and they are updated, as I say, weekly. And of course, the gray portion is to represent the remaining months of what we saw in previous years that, of course, haven't taken place this year. So the first thing that jumps out, just looking at this chart, is that this far-right activity for these groups, which represents both political violence as well as participation in demonstrations and some forms of mobilization activities, such as holding trainings, or, for example, dropping propaganda banners off of highway overpasses, is at its lowest recorded levels since we started tracking United States data at the beginning of 2020. And if we go to the next slide, you can see that this is not the story for all parts of that pie. So this is looking specifically at white nationalist activity, which is included in the previous slide, but again, is one slice of that pie. You can see that this increased substantially from 2022 to 2023. And although it has declined in 2024, that decline is relatively small, or relatively smaller than the overall pie of far-right activity. This is explained by the proliferation of chapters of a couple of notable groups in particular, especially Patriot Front, as well as more recently, chapters of a neo-Nazi group called White Lives Matter, as well as neo-Nazi active clubs, which have formed regional chapters across the United States in the past year and a half, especially. To take one specific group on the next slide that we cover, we can take a look at Proud Boy activity, which is at 1/6 of the level that we saw last year and has declined year over year since 2021. This is really striking. Although it is true that we have quite recent Proud Boy activity in the past couple of weeks, including participation in a brawl during a demonstration in Portland, it is notable just how much this group's activity has declined. There are many different reasons to get into that help to explain the overall phenomena that we've seen in the past 3 slides. And I'm happy to elaborate more on this in the Q&A section. But just to give some major possible reasons for now, the groups such as the Proud Boys saw many of their leaders be arrested following their participation in the January 6th Capitol riots. And in some cases, groups have not recovered fully from that. Some groups have also shifted to less in-person activity and more online threats and harassment, which is something that our next speaker, Shannon from the Bridging Divides Initiative, has some excellent data on, and I'm sure she will discuss at length. And there are a number of other factors to discuss as well. But for now, we'll move on to looking at some of the demonstration drivers that I highlighted earlier, beginning with perhaps most obviously, demonstration activity in support of Donald Trump. Within our data, we track sentiment related to the two presidential candidates. And for those of you who might already be wondering, yes, we are planning to introduce tracking related to Kamala Harris, now that she is the new presumptive Democratic presidential nominee. That will be rolling out with fresh data just as soon as we can. But looking at this graph, and immediately, I think the thing that jumps out is the comparison between 2020 and 2024. You can see that popular demonstration activity around Trump is quite a bit reduced in 2024 compared to 2020. Although, looking at this graph, the gray portion, which of course, as you might expect, represents a much higher level of activity leading up to the November elections, and of course, following them and spilling over into the next year, which you can see there for 2021. So it's likely that we'll see quite a bit more demonstration activity in support of Donald Trump in the lead up to the election. However, it is notable that this level of activity is comparatively so low, given that Trump faced a conviction earlier this year, and that he posted on his social media platform explicitly calling for protests. Of course, we have seen a modest spike in pro-Trump demonstrations following the recent assassination attempt against him. And it's still too early to tell to what extent that will represent a new trend versus a temporary reaction to that attempt. And that's definitely one of the things that we'll be keeping an eye on going forward with the election. To look at another demonstration driver that we track, we can take a look at the next slide here. This is for anti-abortion demonstrations. And of course, you can see in 2022, as you might expect, a large spike in these demonstrations around the US Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade, and some continuing action in the years around that. However, so far this year, we have seen comparatively little activity, and indeed this has fallen to its lowest levels since we started tracking data in the US in 2020. The explanation for this is, again, very complex, and it ties back into some of the things that I've been highlighting earlier. It may also be something related to what Kleena said at the beginning of our presentation regarding a public that is, in general, not particularly energized to be participating in politics, which may be something that has changed recently as we've seen a big shakeup in the presidential election. It could also be that a lot of demonstration activity in the US has been more concentrated around other issues, such as demonstrations over Israel-Palestine, which is something else that we track, and I will highlight for you a little bit later. I've also mentioned on this slide, but have not included a chart as a bit of a teaser, that anti-LGBTQ plus demonstrations in 2024 have declined by roughly 70% compared to the previous year. And I will just use this as an opportunity to plug our most recent analysis piece over on our US Crisis Monitor page, which explores this phenomenon and these developments in depth. It's quite a complicated, again, situation, and there are a number of different factors that may go into helping to explain this. Again, a shift to online threats and harassment as opposed to gathering in person outside, for instance, LGBTQ plus events during Pride Month may be one of the explanations. There's a lot more that we get into, and many more beautiful visualizations on that analysis piece. So just a little plug there. And I'll just spend the rest of my time here briefly breezing through the US Crisis Monitor itself and the way that it can help you access the data that we produce and put it sort of at your fingertips. So if we look at the first slide here, this is a brief overview of what the Crisis Monitor looks like. You can see that it's an interactable map, which demonstrates both demonstration activity as well as the activity of these extremist groups that I highlighted earlier on both this map form as well as the timeline above. On the next slide, you can see that this is broken down not only into the state, but also the county level. And indeed, our data are coded to cities and in some instances, subsections of cities You can get quite specific with the geographic level of analysis there. On the next slide, you can talk about the fact that you can filter this map to specific demonstration drivers. So these are drivers related to immigration, related to abortion, related to access to firearms, related to LGBTQ plus issues, related to sentiment toward presidential candidates, etc. And you can see these both, again, geographically and in the timeline. So as you can see on the next slide, this particular map right now is filtered to Israel-Palestine related activity, specifically demonstrations showing support for Palestine. And this represents a spike in activity around the time of the student encampments earlier this year on the timeline above, as well as the geographic disbursement on the map itself. On the next slide here, you can see that, of course, we've also provided some additional information in terms of the way that these states voted in the 2020 elections. And of course, this also filters to the county level view, which can help to provide some additional insights in terms of where are these demonstrations and where this activity is occurring. On the next slide here, you can see, for example, how useful the state level view for this data can be. This is tracking anti-abortion demonstrations, demonstrations in support of access to abortion in the state of Florida. And you can see, for instance, on the timeline, a huge spike in demonstrations, both around the leaking of the US Supreme Court's draft overturning Roe v. Wade, and then again, once the decision was finally made. And you can get a sense for both when and where these demonstrations happened here. And the same holds true, as you will see on the next slide, for these extremist groups that I discussed earlier. So if you go one slide further, you can see some of the extremist groups that we track, including perhaps most conspicuously Patriot Front, the Proud Boys, etc. Their geographic dispersal and, again, a timeline of their activity. So this, for example, is a map filtered to the activity of the group Patriot Front, and you can see some concentrations of their activity in East Texas, in the Salt Lake City area, in the Northeast. So you can get to know these groups if you're somewhat familiar with them or unfamiliar with them just by playing around with the map. And as I conclude my little advertisement for our tools here on the next slide, you also have a timeline, which can help to show how groups have evolved over time. This, for example, is for neo-Nazi active clubs, which are loosely organized under a group called the Rise Above movement. You can see a proliferation of chapters of this group in the United States, beginning in sort of mid-2023 and continuing to present using this tool. On the last couple of slides here, you can see this again on the state level view. This time we're filtering for White Lives Matter, and this shows the organization of a particular White Lives Matter chapter in some northern rural counties in Alabama, particularly centered around Blount County. And this helps to show how that particular chapter has been especially active in organizing demonstrations. And this type of activity isn't something that you see necessarily in every state related to this group. So I hope that this has piqued your interest and your imagination a little bit, and that I can convince you to go and check out this tool to put these data at your fingertips, and to take a read again of that analysis piece, getting into more depth as to why anti-LGBTQ plus demonstrations and political violence have evolved in the way that they have. And I think on the next slide, indeed, so I will now pass the baton over to Shannon Hiller at the Bridging Divides initiative, who will get further into our presentation today.
Thanks, Kieran, and thanks for walking us through that great new tool. I think the Bridging Divides team has been accused of being super users of the ACLID data. So I know with Richard and others, you'll see us reference some of the ways we use this comprehensive data to understand political violence in the US. I'm going to do three things today, though, to also kind of ground us in the why. I know this panel is on monitoring political violence and threats in this particular moment. But why do we do that? So I'll do a brief introduction to BDI and our work for those who don't know us, really focus on our specific project on understanding threats and harassment to local officials and why we started that project about 2 years ago. I think Kieran kind of set up one of the reasons why in terms of the changing context here in this country. And then because we also focus on the next steps beyond the data, I'll be glad to close with a bit of kind of how do we make sure this work is translated into action? What are the resources and next steps we can each take within our jobs, within our formal roles, but within our communities as well? So on the next slide, I'll do a bit of that quick introduction to BDI and our work. So as you heard, we focus on tracking and mitigating political violence, specifically in the United States. We really do that not just to understand the negative trends, but also because we think it can contribute to a positive vision of a future where thriving communities are prepared, yes, to respond in periods of risk, but are also empowered to address a lot of these root causes and long-term divides that we face as a society, ultimately continue to build the type of multiracial pluralist democracy we can all be a part of. As Kleena mentioned, we've been around for just over 4 years and started in late 2019. On the next slide, you can see some of the ways that we've expanded that work along 3 core objectives. In many ways, we think that taken together, these are contributing to what we hope is a functional early warning, early response system in the US. And so I know many of you may be coming from an international context and that already kind of rings true, but for those who are coming from the US, let me say a bit about what that means. What are the components? What do you need for an early warning, early response system? The first, we think, is reliable data. So not just at a single point in time, but continuously. That was one of the reasons why we came to ACLID first and foremost to help expand in the initial US Crisis Monitor data available ahead of the 2020 election. And I'll go into more depth on why we then kicked off the Understanding Threats and Harassment project to address some of the gaps in data around what was happening, especially at the local level. The second thing you need, though, is really that analysis and insights translated and distributed through trusted and regular means. So for BDI, this means nationally to different groups and stakeholders, government, non-government, but it also means especially in high tempo or high risk states where we have state leads who are doing that day in and day out with communities and others working across different sectors. I think distinct from other countries in the US, this often means knitting together already established and large sectors across different issues so that they can be greater than the sum of their parts in responding to political violence. Or from the research to action side, as one of our partners says, making sure research isn't just a big stack of PDFs on someone's desk, but is actually actionable and can be translated into what next. So, that's the last thing I'd say, especially in terms of the context of just the last 2 weeks and what we're headed into. I think it's critical, especially for those living in between the sort of research and policy side, to think about how we convey this information in a way that inspires action and not just fear alone. To be frank, people, especially in the US, are struggling to figure out a way to know that there's sort of hope for a way out, right? So for BDI, this includes a focus on providing better access to de-escalation training, supporting that sector writ large, but also advising and supporting leaders kind of in the moment when they get some of these negative trends. What's the next step? What's the so what of some of this information? And we really have seen this as one of the highest areas of demand over the past 2 weeks, as folks, I think, in contrast to 2020, do have more tools at their disposal, but still want to know, how to navigate this moment of uncertainty themselves. So let me turn to our specific project on understanding threats and harassment in more detail as one of those tools that we use to better understand what's happening at that local level. So this is a mixed methods approach. In particular, it includes an event data set that I'll get into in more detail, a representative survey that's run quarterly, and in-depth interviews for survey participants that then opt in to speaking with one of our researchers. And we do this together with a consortium of data partners that you see here. We focused on local officials in particular because we thought that was a gap both in the data and in support to folks who are experiencing this type of hostility. So we just kept hearing both from community partners and local leaders themselves that they were reporting incidents to law enforcement, which often were deemed lawful but awful. So they weren't getting follow-up. They didn't know if it was being included. There was no consistent tracking even when it wasn't reported. And so that there was this gap in both data and support to the local level. And so we think projects like these can help to both create a record of a source of analysis and research, but can also be, as I mentioned before, yet another tool in terms of identifying early warning signals from an established baseline that'll be critical in the coming year. You can see on the right-hand side here, one of our qualitative reports from those interviews last year. We'll have another one coming out this year with over 150 officials interviewed. And this has been a critical component of the project to validate both that it seems there's an undercount in the event data and survey data in the way that people describe harassment but don't report it. But also to elevate solutions that local officials themselves are working on. What's been working for them and where do they need more support? On the next slide, I'll just briefly touch on some of the survey data. This is the second component of the mixed methods approach that's run by our survey partners, Civic Pulse. We actually had one of the quarterly surveys in the field right before the assassination attempt and then concluded after. So those results will be out in the coming weeks. And I think it'll be really, unfortunately, interesting to see if that national incident had an impact both on the incidents reported of threats and harassment at the local level, but also we ask folks how worried they are about threats and harassment. And that's one of the indicators I'll be certainly keeping a close eye on when it comes back. As you can see here, we unfortunately see just a consistently high baseline of threats and harassment at the local level. We ask folks over the last 3-month period, and 1 in 3 mayors and local council members report being harassed, and 1 in 6 report being threatened within that window. These are linked to less willingness to engage both in regular aspects of their job, but also run for higher office. And we find consistently that women and racial and ethnic minorities experience these sort of harms and impacts at higher levels. I'll also say that with some small exceptions on insults, the worst types of hostility are experienced across the board, regardless of party and partisanship. It's something we're able to dig into a little bit more in our interviews. So in the interest of time, I'll move on to some of the event data, but I'll just say that analysis from each quarter of these surveys are available on our website, and the full survey data is available by request. If you go to Civic Pulse's website, we're glad to drop in some of the links and ways to access that in the chat. You also see a clip here on the side from a January report with our partners at the Brennan Center, who combine some of this local level data with surveys of state legislators to tease out some of those impacts from the local level up to the state level, and ways in which they may be creating some longer term harms in terms of who feels comfortable serving in public office in particular. So on the next slide, I'll talk about the third and final component of our threats and harassment project, which is the THD, the threats and harassment data set. And so as I said, this focuses at the local level, including elected, appointed, and or municipal offices, and it includes criminal and non-criminal incidents. Unfortunately, what we see is that reported incidents are on the rise. There's a 50% increase from the first quarter of 2022 to the first quarter of 2024. And alongside some of what Kieran was highlighting, we see indications that threats and harassment are, yes, both being used by sort of named groups as a cheaper tactic that has oftentimes less risk of accountability for employing it to reduce civic space, but also potentially being normalized across a much wider range of usages and issues. So the gray component you see here in the graph on the screen is when threats and harassment have been used around oftentimes very local issues or issues that weren't necessarily the hot button issues of the day. And so one of the things that we're watching closely and we think are critical to explore with these data is how much is threats and harassment becoming an acceptable tool to push back on local officials, to anyone in your community, if you disagree with the democratic process. So that's a particularly concerning sign if we're seeing that normalized across both hot button national issues and really hyper local issues like zoning and housing and things like that. So again, these data come out monthly and are available for download on our website. And we've been really glad to see that a wide range of folks are already using it to use in their own local analysis and planning to better understand some of these trends within their communities or within their work as these issues evolve. So on the last slide, as I promised, I'll conclude a little bit with what do we do about it? So as you've heard, from what we see in the threats and harassment data, we'd agree with what Kieran was indicating. And we've seen these lower levels of offline political violence, but that threats and harassment as a tactic and a tool may be sufficient to close down democratic space. And it may kind of get that job done, even if overall offline physical violence remains low. Certainly, 2024 is a very different context than 2020, as Kleena led off in framing. And President Biden stepping down from the ticket just reinforces what was already that reality. Yes, we're not seeing that same type of mobilization, but we also have 4 years of that higher baseline of tensions and potentially wider normalization of this type of concerning rhetoric and threats and harassment. So it's very much in that context that we often like to end on these three broader points. What is the so what of this, regardless of the position you find yourself in? And so the first point, I think, unsurprising on a panel of folks thinking about data and analysis, is to get informed. And so if you're in a role where more regular access to clear information about your specific community, how do you establish those lines of information early and often to be able to get ahead of rumor and act with the most updated information? I also think there's going to be so much of focus on the election itself, but how can we continue to address some of these underlying drivers that are just elevated during the election season? So we really encourage communities and folks anywhere, what are the types of conflicts that could boil over if the election elevates them? How can you start addressing them now? And where are there opportunities to practice conflict resolution or other types of approaches to intervening when tensions get high in your particular role? And then last, I think we've seen sort of mixed results and different types of calls for this last one over the last 2 weeks. Stand up and speak out on threats and harassment before they can get worse at any level. So when we do those conversations with local officials, mayors, and council members across party, they often tell us one of the hardest things is when their neighbors and community members remain silent when they're being threatened or harassed around their work. And so if you see that happening within your community, within your the kind of direct work you do in any context, what are ways that you can work with others or use your position to speak out against that type of harmful rhetoric and demonstrate the type of democracy, the type of community we all want to live in, where we can more constructively resolve conflict. So you can see here on the right side of the screen, these are some of the resources over the last couple of years, both case studies of communities who have done this and ways to access these data. We'll be glad to share some of the links in the chat too, and looking forward to hearing from Richard and how he does exactly this, I think, applies some of the information to his work at Marriott.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Shannon. And thank you to Kleena and Kieran as well for those opening remarks. Such a pleasure to be invited to join all of you today with ACLED and BDI to talk a little bit more about the implementation and contextualization of the kind of risk and trends that we're following at a 30,000 foot level down to the community level and how it impacts us in the private sector as members of the community. As Kleena mentioned at the top, my name is Richard Varda, and I'm one of the team of intelligence analysts with Marriott International, a small hospitality company in over 140 countries and territories, 9,000 hotels and growing. As a portion of my role, I'm proud to represent part of our global safety and security team, covering not only the U.S. elections upcoming, but going through the last election cycle as well, and having some lessons learned, supporting our hotels and above property disciplines through that process. I think one thing that just want to talk about from the top, whether it be the data that Kieran was showing about sort of the trends of participation levels decreasing over time as it relates to more high profile demonstration issues, or to the point that Shannon was making about providing context in tools and resources, and allowing our community members, our associates in the case of Marriott, the ability and empowerment to speak up and say something when they see something. I think all of those map really closely to our own experience over the last 4 years. The 2020 election, in the period from then until now, clearly has had multiple flashpoints, tumultuous periods, a variety of issues of public policy discourse or culture wars that our associates working the very front desk or food and beverage or catering had to grapple and manage on a day-to-day basis. But that period of time hasn't really left us, and so I kind of see, as we lead up to 2024, a bit of the next installment, if you will, or next kind of chapter, leading from the trends we were seeing from 2020. And so with that, 3 top trends that we're kind of seeing from our own lens, and this is me speaking without having the data right in front of me. But one thing that I thought kind of rung true from the presentations that my colleagues presented on just momentarily ago was overall fatigue kind of in the activist and voter sentiment system, whether this be a post-pandemic fatigue, whether this be a return to interests that folks generally threw themselves into at the time. Could that explain a little bit less transition from the online rhetoric that we see to actual turnout participation in public policy debates and protests or activations? The second would be a little bit of perhaps a chilling effect following January 6th and the sort of prosecutorial narrative that we've been tracking over time, with the lack of certain leaders organizing, may have led to a decentralization of these groups, and therefore autonomy has devolved to a much more localized level. I think Shannon hit the nail on the head when we've seen some larger public policy debates that were once heated and brought out quite a few participants to the streets or to act out against a certain event or an issue, have turned into more hyper-localized issues, whether we've seen it over education policy, gender policy, healthcare policy, and the like. And so I think there's an interesting trend that we'll be tracking through the 2024 into the future as it relates to that. And then the last that I'm not seeing as much necessarily data, but one we're following as it relates to group bookings, and I'll kind of touch on that here in a moment, being one of the largest town halls, if you will, or event space providers within the country, is funding and priority shifts. I would not necessarily go out on a limb to say it has dried up in any which way, but some of the activism and organization and the activations, as it were, around public policy discourse and kind of that spectrum that may lead from First Amendment demonstrations and nonviolent demonstrations and a ramp up into potential political violence flashpoints. There's something to be said that the political funding, as it were, the funding sources or the political entrepreneurs, if you will, whether they have exited the space by choice or by legal determinations, is, I think, a narrative we're tracking closely. And so this kind of leads up to what I was saying at the top, in that the story doesn't quite leave us from 2020 as we jump into 2024. One thing that we've tried really, really hard to do within the risk advisory space, the global intelligence space, is to provide tools and resources and ground truth our risk intelligence as best as we can. we understand that we will never be the exact subject matter experts of any one individual community, like our hotel, associates can be. They're a member of the community. They're interstitched. They don't live in a vacuum, necessarily. And so the best we do is to draw, parallels and trends to show, is this an increasing possibility, or are we closing that window of surprise for them? And as a result of that, we want to make sure we tie all of our risk analysis and the conceptualization to an action point, an action item. For those that may work, in the private sector and commercial space, or even just any organization, I'm sure there are reams and papers and intranets full of policy guidelines, guidance, and the like, but sometimes it can be difficult to navigate. And so one of our chief kind of clarion calls for this election cycle is, if we see a trend line, surely there's a guidance note or a policy or some sort of action item that folks, when faced with uncertainty, can grab onto, whether that be, simple actions like situational awareness training, whether it be through a webinar, in-person tabletop exercises with a small group or a large group, whether it just be reinforcement of say something, see something during stand-up meetings at a hotel each morning, to really provide agency from everyone from housekeeping to F&B to marketing to say if something doesn't feel right, this seems a little bit out of the norm, know who to go to and report such activities. And we found that level of support can go quite a long way, and happy to touch on kind of the upcoming DNC and Marriott's role here next month in Chicago, and how we're kind of democratizing, as we're calling it, the intelligence process and providing equal opportunity to all stakeholders for access to information, and then therefore the guidance notes to better prepare. One thing that, as I turn the floor over before we open to Q&A, is, of course, we see major flashpoints in large cities such as Washington, D.C., where I reside and work out of our Marriott HQ. But we've really seen a tone shift, and this goes back to Shannon and Kieran's points of the localization, as it were. And so markets that, we are more carefully watching, and of course, we're watching as many trends as possible and impacts to major cities, but we're looking at more heterogeneous politics, right? And so if you're looking at states that, within the U.S., domestic electoral race context that we call battleground states, such as the Wisconsins, the Michigans, Pennsylvanias of the world, or similarly at states that, have segments of the population that would identify with either end of the pole, whether it be further to the left or further to the right, but they have opportunities to encounter one another over protests or counter protest activities, say at their state capitol or local courthouse. Those are some of the markets that we're following very, very closely from an intelligence lens, whether it be historic, not having historic data looking through some of these issues, unlike some of the major cities that have encountered large-scale demonstrations as well as events of political violence, or at the same time making sure that those hotels that might be hosting such events, such as a fundraiser or a conference or something as large as the DNC coming up here, are well prepared and equipped with some of the knowledge of the trend lines that we're tracking. With that, I think I'd like just to turn the floor back over to our panel here to start Q&A, but I'd be very happy to take any questions as it relates to the data, the trend lines, and just a note of thanks once again for allowing us from the commercial side to participate in this very important conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. That's brilliant. There are a number of questions that have come in. I want to thank everybody for their detailed and insightful presentations. I have a few questions for each of you that I might, it's in some ways an amalgamation of what you've been asked in the chat. Kieran, I'm going to ask you something about the sense that this is a right-skewed discussion, especially around the threats during the election, and whether or not the new groups that you mentioned in your presentation are in fact new, or they revived or different than the groups that we saw from 2020 onwards, and whether or not there is in fact a distinction between the activity on the right and left spectrum. I'll start there, and then I'll suggest some other questions in a little bit.
Yeah, so there are a couple of different things to unpack there, but I think first is because those are the groups that we see be associated with the highest number of violent events within our data set, as well as the highest rate of violence in terms of their participation in all events in our data set. We do track extremist groups across the political spectrum, but in terms of those that are the most salient, we're talking about the likelihood of violence based on our past data over the past 4 years. That is what has been shown by the data, and so that's why I highlight it here. On our interactive tool, you can explore some other groups from across the political spectrum, and we certainly consider those in analysis as well. In terms of the, also to briefly respond to another question that I happened to see go by there, we're talking about the demonstration drivers on those slides after the initial few. That is for all demonstrations relating to those drivers, not just demonstrations associated with specific named groups. And then to your question as to whether these groups that we're tracking are truly new or whether it's shifting activity from the past, I think that can be a mixed bag and it depends on the group. Even between different groups, there can be sort of a permeable membrane wherein members can be members of multiple different groups and there's quite a lot of rebranding and overlap between many of these groups. Certainly in terms of these chapters that have sprung up across the country, it will depend again on a chapter to chapter basis, but many of the organizers may have been previous participants in neo-Nazi activity, whereas the rank and file members might be more likely to be younger, for example, and therefore new participants in this kind of activity. Certainly this type of white nationalist or neo-Nazi activity in the US is not unprecedented. And there's a long history that we've even gotten into in some of our own earlier US crisis monitor analysis. But in the interest of not talking about that for our remaining time, I will end the explanation there.
Thanks very much. I also want to note to many people in the chat that we have an extensive discussion around the Palestinian protests, both, of course, on both sides, available on the Crisis Monitor page. Shannon, I have a question for you, and in fact, it's very similar to one from Camilla here, which is that in your analysis of threats and harassment of local officials, you mentioned both women and minorities experience these harms more frequently, and that it was a much better predictor than whether or not they were a member of a particular party. And I found that very interesting. Camilla obviously did too. So can you talk a little bit more about whether or not there's something we need to learn in there about a specifically female threat or minority threat rather than a party distinct threat, and whether it's similar or different than other places that you've worked?
Sure, thanks. And in terms of whether it was a better predictor than partisanship, I'd have to get back to the team on exactly how that breaks down. Because we look at mayors, local council members, and have recently added school board members. One of the challenges obviously is the sample size quarter to quarter. And so as we've continued to run the survey over a number of years, we increasingly can answer some of those questions in aggregate. So definitely refer you to detailed methodology questions on the survey approach to our partner Civic Pulse and to the team who works with them most closely. What we do see, though, are statistically significant differences for women and racial and ethnic minorities, even quarter to quarter. And so I think there's two things about that. One is it's clear this is being experienced by men and other, like across the board. So I would say that it's too high for everyone. And as you heard, a third of all officials experiencing threats on average in the last 3 months. I think it's too high. When you look, though, at reports of even physical attacks, it's statistically significantly higher for racial and ethnic minorities than for others. So I think and we don't see those same type of statistical differences quarter to quarter for partisanship, or for ideology broken down more granularly than partisanship. So you can see all these breakdowns in the each quarter's slide deck. And I think I was about to type in one of the other questions to recommend to folks the Brennan Center's report from January again, because I think they tease out and we're hoping to explore with them this year a little bit more about why is it that state legislators didn't report that same distinction? And one of the questions we've surfaced that we're hoping to explore more this year is that it's also possible that women and racial and ethnic minorities serving in local and state office are experiencing a higher frequency of threats. So everyone's getting threatened sometimes, and they're getting threatened often and frequently, and with more severe forms of hostility, which we're seeing reported as having higher levels of impact on the officials themselves. I think just to link it to what we hear in conversations with folks, men and women both, one of the most harmful types of incidents and ways that it impacts people's willingness to serve is when it affects their family. So I think a lot of officials are willing and in fact tell us that they're not going to let this chase them out of office. They are really committed and dedicated to serve, which I think has been a requirement for women and racial and ethnic minorities in the recent past in the US. But it's when it starts impacting their families that a lot of officials decide it's not worth the cost.
Thanks very much. It's very harrowing. Richard, I have a question for you about whether or not you have some reliable early warning signs in your work. And then for everybody, Richard included, of course, what you think the most significant trend is that you've unearthed and we've discussed here that you keep top of mind, I'd say, until the end of the year. But I'll turn to Richard now. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that. I sort of touched on it, those like three kind of trends we're watching overall, but I truly have been very interested in over the last maybe 2 years more intensely so just the localization of the public policy discourse, right? And so you can have these very large national debates. You see images, here in Washington, D.C., in front of the White House, in front of the Capitol, and the like. The markets, both here in New York, even, kind of forecasting a little to Chicago, don't want to get ahead of myself here, but, some of these markets and our properties and our leaders are more accustomed to a tempo, to that generalized rhetoric, to that training of de-escalation. The trend I'm watching is, are we going to see more smaller events that pop up within, tertiary markets, secondary markets that we would consider, right? And so those in which our hotel leaders, through no fault of their own, because they came to work every day to bring the best, hospitality experience for the traveling public, whether it be, presidents down to someone, traveling for a soccer tournament, what have you, over the weekend. Are they now playing host, or are they hosting a group booking for some of these groups that have seemingly popped up that we were unaware of, previously? Did they take on a different tenor? Did they misrepresent themselves while booking? And so those are some of the issues. And so we're fortunate enough to know, being in the hospitality industry, early indicators. So if we know there's, say, a big event happening in a market, are transient rates going up, occupancy rates going up in the suburbs are like, so that's an early warning indicator that there might be some legs to this movement that, was happening in a closed off channel on Telegram, WhatsApp, Discord, what have you. And now it's kind of, coming out into the forefront. Or is this event one of those just, again, kind of building momentum, but that conversation engagement has remained online. And so I'll be watching very closely, because we saw a similar trend both with Supreme Court decisions, with the Stop the Steal movement, with more recently boards of education at very local, county level, local levels, and where some of our properties that are not here in Washington, D.C., or the seats of power be truly impacted as a result of that. And so providing the resources, tools, and context for our leaders, and to grab their attention, right? Because they're reading the news every day, no doubt about it, and they're well equipped to respond to local environment. But I think maybe Shannon said it best, is to contextualize it and know that like we can't always be operating at such a high tempo, even though the risk level is already so high. Um, your guidance will be falling on um, people covering their ears as it results in for us kind of crying red alerts, regardless. So it's about finding that balance, and so I'll be watching very closely if things start organizing at a more grassroots level than kind of these national movements that we saw during the 2020 cycle.
Thanks so much, Richard. I mean, we've seen also in the last few years, I think, that there has been an atomization of a lot of groups, and they don't particularly feel aligned or cooperating or coordinated, but that could become a groundswell without noticing that the groundswell is much more organic than maybe led from above. I do want to give a few moments quickly to Kieran and of course to Shannon for their own most significant trend before we say goodbye. And I want to thank everybody, of course, for their really wonderful presentations and questions. So I'll go to Kieran first and then Shannon, please.
Yeah, thanks again for your engagement, everyone. In terms of the things that are on the top of my mind at the moment, I think there's two main ones, which, given the amount of time we have left, I will summarize quite quickly. The first of them is just whether the past 2 weeks represent some kind of a turning point for all of the things we've been talking about today. Certainly having a different prospective nominee for the Democratic Party in Kamala Harris has a lot of potential implications for what we might see in demonstrations broadly, political violence broadly, as well as the activity of some of the groups we've been talking about. Whether the populace will be more energized if the election is seen as more contentious or exciting, depending on different people's perspectives, as well as how groups might respond to her as a person and as a candidate. There's a lot more to talk about there, but in general, the other thing I would highlight are these continued demonstrations around Israel and Palestine. Certainly, we saw an enormous spike in data, in demonstrations in our data toward the end of the academic school term earlier this year, and then a fall off in those demonstrations once the school term ended, and many of the students who were participating in them, especially in these encampments on university campuses, left those campuses for that reason. So it remains to be seen what will happen when, for instance, the school term resumes later this year, if we'll see a return to that level of demonstration activity. And that will depend a lot on the way that those demonstrations are organized, as well as what happens with that situation and with the United States' posture toward that situation. And again, lots of more detail to get into there, but I will leave it there for now. Thanks.
Cheers, Kieran. Thanks. Shannon, please close us out with your most significant trend that you are worried about.
Sure. Well, I'll be brief on the trend, and then, as I promised in my presentation, try and close us out on what I think is a bit of a positive trend as we find ourselves in this context. So I'd first repeat that concern that threats and harassment are being normalized as a tool. And so I think there's a lot of great work being done at the local level, and mentioned in the question and answer chat a bit about how folks are getting really creative, not just on physical security, but how to stand up and demonstrate a more positive vision. What's most concerning is that we sort of lack those examples at a national level. We don't have institutions we turn to right now, even up into and including the courts, as a place to resolve conflict where everyone would trust the results. And that's one of the combination is the most concerning trend to me. What gives me hope going into the election, though, is thinking back to when we were talking in 2019, Clina, we were just starting to code this type of data in the US and to think about how it could be used. And now we find ourselves instead with the types of 4 years of comparative insights that Kieran was highlighting, 2 years of threats and harassment data insights from officials themselves who have been navigating it, and community leaders and others who now have been applying new ways of thinking about conflict, connecting them to longstanding organizing and resources that have been used here in the US. So I think we're headed into a particularly challenging time, but that there's been a lot of preparation and progress made, even just in the last 4 years, and how we can work together to address it.
Wonderful. That is a delightful ending. And of course, related to evidence and data and what we can learn from it. So I really appreciate that. Thank you everybody for both attending and for presenting and for all of your insights that were shared today. I hope we can do this again before the election and that we will be roundly positive during that discussion. But if that's not necessarily the case, you can rely on all of these organizations to make sure that people are up to date with information about safety and security in the States. And thank you again. Goodbye, everybody.